Who do we trust? Absolutely fascinating, and I really was delighted to be asked to introduce this because when you have to introduce a subject, it really makes you think about it much more deeply, and so my opportunities to look up this subject, think on it, and talk to people about it have been really fascinating. I've had a few good conversations in the last few weeks. And I think in my work as a psychiatrist, I've certainly noticed how this lack of trust, this feeling of lack of trust, can lead to fear. And that fear often manifests as anxiety. And I think we're all aware of society as a whole, and many people, we come across how people are feeling quite anxious these days about all kinds of things. And especially the mental health of younger people, I think we're becoming more aware of how precarious this can be. And why might this be so? And of course, we're all aware of how political figures and political systems are causing us all to feel quite anxious. And we don't, we're not quite sure what's going on in the world. So I hope this evening we're going to be able to explore this notion of trust and the world situation in much more depth. But now I would like to invite our two speakers to come up on the stage, Professor Mike Hardy and Sister Jayanti. So Professor Mike Hardy is the Executive Director of the Centre of Trust, Peace and Social Relations at Coventry University. And he's really had a lifetime's work of working with communities in conflict. Absolutely fascinating life, travelled all over the world and been in some amazing places. He led the British Council's global programme on intercultural dialogue and worked with difference and community relations. Worked with support to non-governmental organisations in the Palestine territories, worked in the Safer Belfast Cohesion Mapping Project. So as you can see, it's just a flavour of some of the hotspots in the world where he's been an active person really working for building communities of trust. And he describes himself as a passionate scholar of trust, which is a lovely way, I think, to really have a sense of how trust is absolutely at the core of his work and his life and his being. So welcome, Mike. And Sister Jayanti is the European Director of Brahma Kumari's World Spiritual University. She's been a spiritual teacher for over 50 years, dedicated her life to meditation and spiritual study, self-transformation and the service of humanity. And she's been a pioneer for the advocate of the spiritual basis of caring for the earth. And I know Jayanti's gone to all the COP meetings, the climate change summits, and has seen how the whole idea of spiritual values and consciousness raising is becoming more and more integral to the whole environmental cause. She's worked with the United Nations, our representative at the United Nations in Geneva, and really worked on championing peaceful initiatives and brought spiritual principles to the discussion tables of such a wide variety of professionals, politicians, economists, business leaders, scientists, nearly everyone, every area of life. Jayanti has really been championing spiritual values and their importance in these debates. So welcome, Sister Jayanti. So I'm going to invite both Mike and Jayanti to share their thoughts on trust for about 10 minutes each, and then we will observe, we will listen in as they have a conversation between themselves about what their work is with trust and questions they might have for each other. So Mike, if you would like to kick off.
Thank you so much, and it's fantastic to be here, and I'm quite humbled. Let me start by being really, really clear. I'm not an expert on trust. I'm somebody who's really concerned about it. I'm a scholar, I'm a student, I'm learning every day still. And I thought I'd start by saying how I got to this place. You know, your life is your journey, as Gandhi said. I started as an economist. I was a young economist, interested in mergers and acquisitions, interested in Wall Street. I spent some time at New York University, and I came back, and my Vice-Chancellor at Leeds lent me to the Foreign Office, said they were looking for some professors to go and give advice to emerging countries and to developing countries who are challenged by their place in the global marketplace. So that's a standard entry. When I got to Egypt, I was posted to Egypt, I found that I couldn't really explain by my training, by my understanding of economics, what was happening in Egypt, because essentially I was observing a set of social relationships, some internal and some external, that were driven by things beyond my comprehension. So I began to explore. I've always been a nosy person, always been inquisitive. I came back to London and told the Foreign Office I was of no value there because I didn't understand the nature of the relationships between the people to whom I was engaging. This came out, 20 years later, as about the behavior in the relationship. And it came, now I look at it very carefully, as being about whether people trust each other, whether they understand each other, whether they're able to have dialogue in a meaningful sense with each other, if the relationships they forge are purposeful. But in those days I didn't, and I was very keen to understand what I was missing, what I didn't understand at all. So I began to be interested in identity, because what I'd seen in my travels, I'd spent time in the Palestinian territories, time in Indonesia, time in the United States, all really strange places, strange in terms of my own background. And I began to become really interested in identity. And the big word on the title of our seminar this evening is not trust, it's actually who. Because I was really focused on the way in which everyday people described their identity and who they were. They described them by what they looked like, what team they supported, their ethnicity, their faith, their friends. They described themselves by how other people described them. But actually, what I was observing, the transformation for me, was that identity was more about how people behaved, rather than who they were by what symbols or what tribes they were attached to. And it seemed to me that much of the challenges we were having in our conflicted communities, in our conflicted world, was about people's obsession with who they were in terms of their difference one from another, rather than the similarities of behavior, or at times the differences in behavior. There's quite a long circle, and I'm happy to talk more about some of those developing paths. But I arrived back after 15 or 16 years of working in diplomatic areas in international organizations. And I went back to school, and I was given the opportunity to develop a center at Coventry University. Coventry is an iconic city around its traumatic experiences in the war, when it came from a period of conflict and destruction to commitment to peace and reconciliation. So the cathedral was very inspirational for me. And when I visited there and somebody said, come to Coventry and build a centre which develop more scholarship around the things that you're questioning and you've been questioning, I did. And we went, and when we analysed, when we did as academics do, we reflected on the gaps, on the things that were important, what areas of study could we contribute that weren't being pursued elsewhere. It came down to feelings of whether trust was the glue that somehow was missing in many relationships that were causing difference to be difficult, and difference now increasingly to be a violent part of relationships between people, between communities in this connected world. So we established the Centre for Trust, Peace and Social Relations. The three elements of work, and it's cross-disciplinary, and I won't do more of a plug than that. It's come and find us on the web and look at the work we're doing. And I wanted in my last couple of minutes to focus more sharply on trust. One of the things that, as an academic, you do is you're able to, if you're persuasive to funders, to get people to provide resources for you to study critical issues that can make a real difference to people's lives in conflicted places. And I'm going to talk about three. I could talk about several. We have 61 projects in 37 countries currently. I have a team of around 60 academics. Rwanda, Mongolia, and Syria. Three really interesting and very difficult places. And I go to difficult places not because it's fun, but because they're sharp and they give us some real strength of insight. In Rwanda, colleagues of mine are studying the reintegration of boy soldiers, of children who are taken from their families at 7 or 8 years old, are put into circumstances of horrendous violence and used as frontline soldiers in civil wars. You'll have read about it, you'll have seen it, you'll have abhorred it, and been horrified by it. But the study we were doing was about how do you move forward, all that horror behind you. How do you take an 8-year-old and reintegrate them into their community, into their family? Some of them have been away for 6 or 7 years. You can imagine how they've changed. But how too have their community and family changed? The greatest challenge we have in reintegration, in building peaceful futures, in giving hope out of those experiences, is to understand the processes at work. It won't surprise you that many children are happy to be coming home, are liberated from a period in which they've found ways of dealing with the violence in which they were in, only to be totally rejected when they arrive back into their family, by their siblings, by their parents, by their neighbours. Because what happened in the process of all that trauma was that a fundamental relationship of trust between parent and child, between brother and sister, was somehow affected. Rebuilding that is very difficult, and it teaches us that rebuilding trust when you lose it is an almost impossible task. In Mongolia, a very different assignment, very interesting. Mongolia is a tiny little country in terms of population, but a vast part of the former Soviet Empire. And we arrived there, 3 million people, 5 million horses, this amazing tundra, to find a people that had lived under the Soviet Union with a government that in their history had been very detached, interested only in its own self. Mongolia was part of a big empire, managed and administered from a distant capital in Moscow. Over the decades of that relationship, Mongolians had learned in their DNA, had been brought up not to trust politicians, because politicians had not their interests at heart. They were serving the needs of a far distant place. And yet now, Mongolia, since the changes, is a very free, democratic country. It has 37 political parties. It is recognized as the most liberated political system in the former Soviet Union. People pursue and vote for their parties, for their nominated representatives in parliament. But what the government had observed is that the minute you became a politician, the people didn't trust you. The people didn't trust politicians, even if they were their own. And we've had a fascinating 2-year research project in trying to help the government to grow trust when trust should be an automatic thing, but it isn't. Part of the work that we're doing there is looking at whether there's a regulatory framework that supports the building of trust, but the building of trust is the theme. In Syria, I was reflecting only this morning on the news of 15 refugees who froze to death on the mountains last night, walking from the traumas of their hometown to try and get safety for themselves and families in Lebanon. They had trusted a group of smugglers. They had put their life and their security into the hands of a group of paid intermediaries who were taking them from Syria to Lebanon. You may have read this in the news. They were attacked by a storm, the weather turned, the mountain became a very hostile place. The smugglers who they trusted left. A couple of days later, the army finds 15 people, of whom I think 6 were children. So what's gone on there? What can we learn from the study and the work we're doing with the refugees on the move, the migrant populations that are currently moving from A to B for all sorts of reasons? What can we learn about how their trust and their trust relationships are formed and how they're lost. Part of our studies there have been talking to migrants on the move, finding that the extent to which they trust smugglers as opposed to their local government or the militias or the armies that have been protecting them. Why is that taking place? Interestingly, in our research, 40% of smugglers are normally family. They're not somehow gangsters who wander in and exploit the circumstance. So it helped us again point to those issues of where trust comes from. And I'll leave you, if I may, with some of the conclusions. And again, I'm happy to come back. What I've done is talked about my journey, but talked about 3 small examples of contexts in which we can explore to understand trust and trust building. In terms of conclusions, what we know from our research is that there are conditions in which trust is more likely to be built and sustained than not. And therefore, in our findings, the first is in your relationship and your reflection of 5 minutes ago, when you were thinking about who you trusted. Go back and revisit that. It's very important, we find, to be recognizing a competence, an ability, a capability in the person you're seeking to assess as to whether you trust them or not. You tend to trust people who are clearly capable and competent. Secondly, integrity is important. You tend to trust people who have integrity, who have a set of values that are obvious, transparent, who walk their talk. Thirdly, benevolence is important, as was mentioned earlier. You would tend to trust people where you think that they're worrying and concerned about you as well as themselves, where they extend to others, where others are important to them. And finally, you look for predictability. Do people react and respond in the same way when they're confronted with a similar circumstance? Or do they just pick a solution out of the sky? Think of global leaders now and use those 4 benchmarks against them. But think of your neighbor, think of your milkman, think of your postman, think of the people that affect you in every day. Do you trust them or do you not? And I think you may well find that those who you trust have those characteristics. They have a sense of competence, they give you value, they have a sense of integrity, of honesty and adherence to sacred values of some kind or other. They're benevolent and they're predictable, reliable, consistent in their behavior. And it takes me full circle. My identity, I would like to be measured and recognized by how I behave rather than how I'm described. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much. So, some nice thoughts to extend our theme and to keep us thinking on the subject. So I'd now like to invite Sister Jayanti to share her thinking on the subject of who do we trust.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Mike, for the things that you've shared so powerfully. My own journey has been a spiritual one, and my understanding of the subject is also from that particular dimension, though of course it then comes into human interaction and relationships and so on. And when I think about any aspect of life, one of the basic formulae that I've been given is that you have to start inside, and that's what then extends outside. So the question for me is, to what extent am I able to trust myself, and what does that depend on? And if I can learn to trust myself, and I don't start with that, but it's a process of learning, if I can trust myself, then I can begin to trust others around me also. And I've seen it develop in this way in all the seniors of our organization. And as we were sitting there when we were having our one-to-one conversation, I was seeing the photograph of the woman who was the head of the organization from 1969 through to 2007. That's quite a long stretch of time. And she was 40-something when she took on the mantle of leadership, and she played that role of being the leader, and she was able to inspire trust in everyone who met with her, not just people who were close to her and knew her well, but strangers would come and they would find that she inspired and awoke trust in their hearts. And I see that some of you know Dadi Janki, and again she's an amazing role model. So I've known people like this, and of course Brahma Baba. We are honouring this month Brahma Baba. It's a special month for him, and I see how his trust in himself, his trust in God, and also his trust in us. I was very young when I first met him, and at the time when I decided that this is to be my life, Brahma Baba trusted me, and I didn't know whether I would be able to manage a spiritual life of surrender. And in those days, it wasn't such an easy experience, having grown up here, having not lived in India for many years, then to think about a life of surrender and living in an ashram in India when things were very, very basic and simple in the 60s. It was a tall order, but I thought, yes, this is what I would like to try. But it was Brahma Baba's faith in me that said, I can see it. I could see it even earlier. I know you can do it. And so that was something that was very powerful for me. Brahma Baba's trust in me at that time, and then a little while later on saying to me, go back to London and do some service there. And I'd only been following the teachings of Raj Yoga for about 14 months at that time. And I knew that there wasn't any center in outside of India at that time. But again, his trust in me. And so, well, I came with that trust and many things happened. So I see how somebody who has trust in themselves that they've developed through a spiritual awakening are able to trust others and inspire them to do things that normally they couldn't have done. I'm seeing that many of us who came to Raj Yoga when we were very young, it was this sort of trust that the dadis, the seniors, had in us that allowed us to develop and grow. And so where does this trust in the self come from? Many of the things that you've shared, of course, the aspect of competence and benevolence and predictability, you've articulated it in a very simple package, but these would be the sort of things that definitely I would connect with. And firstly, just starting with the subject of my own inner dignity, and what is it that I value in myself? How is it that I can develop self-esteem? And I see that self-esteem comes very, very much from being able to follow my own inner core values. If I see that what my conscience is saying and what I'm actually doing are aligned together, I'm going to be able to value myself, have that inner dignity and that trust in myself. And when I don't see that in myself, never mind what others are seeing, but when I don't see that in myself, my own confidence in myself and my trust in myself begins to shake a little. And so to be able to develop trust in the self, I need to be able to follow my own core values. And I discover what those values are through silence, through meditation. It's connected very much with what you said about identity also. When I look at my external identity, this is how others see me, but it's also shaping how I see myself. And so that external identity doesn't tell you very much about who I am as a person. And when you said behavior is what creates the identity, yes, absolutely. Who I am is the being that I am inside, not the external package, not the external form. And when I understand the inner being and am expressing those values that are within the soul in my life out there, that is then the coherence, the connection of the inner and the outer. But that's also part of then the trust that I'm able to develop in myself. Another aspect of trust for me has been very much being able to trust in God. Until I started to meditate, I wouldn't have been able to say, I even believe in God. I'd heard ideas from Hinduism, from Christianity, a little bit from Judaism, but I didn't really know anything. And I didn't know whether I believed or I didn't believe. And meditation opened the door for me to know myself, but also to begin the journey of knowing God. And as I began to meditate and experience the connection with God and what came to me from God, that allowed my trust in God to grow, but also together with that, studying spiritual teachings. I don't think it was just the silence and the meditation that allowed me to be able to trust God. It was that, definitely that experience, but together with that, it was also the study of spiritual knowledge that resonated with not just what I'd been thinking about. It's not that God agrees with me and so I trust God. It was opening up doors that I could explore and begin to understand and put together bits of the puzzle of life. The jigsaw puzzle started to fit into place through the study of those teachings. And so that again gave me a lot of trust in God, knowing that these ideas, these concepts, these teachings have come from that source. And so that faith and trust in God, that began to grow, and I know that that's been also part of my journey of my own dignity, my own self-esteem, and so the trust that I have in myself. And thirdly, I began to see how following spiritual teachings and meditating was able to bring about transformation in myself. And so where I could see that this was my behavior earlier, and maybe I didn't like it, but I couldn't do anything about it, then following a certain discipline and practice, I was able to bring about change within that. And so the whole journey of transformation was able to inspire trust that, yes, this is the direction to be going in. And so as that trust grows in the self, it's much, much easier to be able to trust others too. And trust in God is relatively easy. Trusting human beings, when you see the good in them, but you also see things that are not so good. And so how do I trust them? And I know that because of my own journey of transformation, I can learn to trust, knowing that they too are going through their journey, and so they will also come to that point where they'll have learned and moved on further. So that's inspired trust and allowed trust to grow. When you have a community where it's many backgrounds of social strata, many backgrounds of professions, careers, no profession, but also race and religion and nationality. And here we have a tight-knit community of about 200 or so that come together every day, every morning, and about 60 of us who work together in this house through the day. And at the weekends, that's also part of our family. We have about 400 people that come together. So it has so much variety, so much difference, and that's not even counting the different personalities. I'm just counting the different aspects of the identities, the external identities. But it's an amazing process of learning about each other, valuing the differences, recognizing the specialities, and then working together with a common goal. I think that aspect of having a shared vision of a better world in the future and being filled with that passion, that inspiration that we can make a better world happen. So it's that vision and that motivation that holds this community together, I think, and allows us to come together whatever other differences there may be. So maybe shared vision is an important aspect of trust building.
So having heard each other's little spiels and the discussion we had earlier and everything, are there any questions you have of each other, or anything you'd like to explore in more depth? Mike, is there something or an issue or an area that you?
So I'm always hugely impressed by people who are further down the road than I am in some of the journeys. So thank you for those insights. But I'm also a fairly grounded person, and the project I'm working on at the moment for a book which I've called Dialogue at the Edge. Right. So I've spent a long time looking and researching and observing dialogue between people of difference. Your community is fascinating because it's quite a safe community in the sense that we have a relationship and a trust-building relationship between people who have clarity about their common purpose and vision, who share this and find a space to have safe dialogue and open dialogue and all the characteristics that you and I know are so important. But I've been interested in the last 6 months or so on this project at trying to focus in on places where it's what I call the edge, where dialogue is really, really quite tricky, where suspicion drives and cynicism and past failures and inconsistencies and injustices are very powerful. And there, to get any clarity about how on earth we can inject more trust between people in these places, this of course makes you very grounded and it's very so. I think we're missing a trick or two if we fail to think of spirituality as a contributor, even in the most difficult places. And I wondered what insights you could share on that.
It's been fascinating for me to see how over my journey coming back from India to England and seeing a situation where people were recognizing meditation, but it was still very much a fringe thing in 1969, to today where meditation's actually been accepted. And so things like mindfulness have been introduced by people like Andrew into the House of Lords, the House of Commons, and so on. So it's really quite amazing to see how there has been this growth of interest in spirituality. And yes, I think that definitely dialogue in difficult situations is missing a very big trick. And so it's nice to hear you say that. I think the contribution of spirituality would be where people learn to see the inner person, the inner being, rather than the externals. And we're so used to putting people in boxes by the externals that we see, that we see ourselves that way, we see others in that way. And so then we become very rigid in our positions. But if I myself come to an awareness of my own inner identity that's linked with my values and my behavior is expressed in that way, I'm seeing you also in the same way. And even if one person out of the two changes their vision towards the other, then there's hope. Then you're able to inspire a new type of perspective and a new type of exchange that can happen. There was a very interesting project we did many years ago, and the question was, what is your vision of a better world? And when we were speaking to people in Israel and speaking to people in Jordan, no surprise for you, but their vision was the same. Because we found that people actually have common values. The values that existed in Israel and the values that existed in Jordan were actually the same. And that's true of any person of any background. And so if you can start looking at the core values that people share and start having an exchange on the basis of that, a simple question. When was the last time you experienced genuine joy? And you evoke something which is a positive memory in one, and that triggers the same in the other. And you can imagine that what happens at that moment is that they're sharing very beautiful memories and they're finding a bond that links them together. And so it's taking them out of that situation of conflict in which they're entrenched. And so I think bringing spirituality can make a big, big difference.
So it was, I'm very interested in looking, as I've said, not because I'm obsessed with the extreme conditions of humankind, but it's sharper, and because I'm an impatient scholar, so I think looking at the extreme cases sometimes allows one to look at with clarity. But we've been looking, for example, at what drives young people, 16, 17 years old, of both genders, to throw away their lives and go and fight in the desert in the Middle East. How can we explain this process? The textbook talks about radicalization or whatever. For me, it's a great loss that something's happening here, that young people should do that. And the findings we have are related to trust, that young people find themselves quite isolated by the nature of social relations that currently exist. And two or three things become quite powerful when you're isolated. One, if you have no sense of dignity and respect, and you touched on this, I think this is hugely important. If there's an absence of respect and you feel nobody respects you for who you are or for how you operate, that reinforces this sense of isolation. Also, young people are passionate about social injustice that takes place over long periods of time, and they see no changes. I think there's a lot of good in radicalized young people who see social injustice. They may be naive in the way they go and deal with it, but have really influenced it. And finally, a lot of young people find no systematic and easy way of securing change peacefully. So they can't see a process where they can have a representative parliamentary democracy that actually solve some of these injustices. It doesn't. So all these things then leave you as an isolated young person who feels you have to take action of some kind else. And then there's lots of people, of course, who come along and prey on that and encourage it. Now, I think that level of understanding helps us look more carefully at how we might change things to build a little more trust in those vulnerable people. And I see trust as very much tied up with vulnerability, in other words. And being vulnerable makes it very difficult to develop strong trust. And we shouldn't expect to be able to bring trust as a solution and as a panacea, that everybody has to trust everyone. That's not going to be the case. But people have to lock into communities of trust that help them through the crisis that they find. And that's what I'm really encouraged by. If you look at the positive things, people do seek to build communities of trust, as you have so powerfully, and we can see such a strong example here. And we need to use that as a model for saying, let's build more trust in communities of trust that can begin to bounce into each other. So communities trusting other communities, and so grow it from the ground up, by making myself clear.
What happens here is that because people are drawn from different backgrounds and different communities, whatever changes they have experienced within themselves, they become instruments to go out within those communities and inspire trust within their communities also. So it's like planting seeds, and so seeds are planted and then they go out and plant more seeds. And so definitely to have a better world is going to depend on a different awareness, an awareness of the spiritual identity of the self, and that connection with the divine. I believe that that's a very important factor also, because that allows the possibility of positive change to happen. When you were talking about these young children who went out and come back and they're rejected by their family, well, think about how spirituality in that situation could make a huge difference. Knowing that the child has come back, and definitely the power of God's love can heal so much, and so being able to share that love with a child who's returned. So I see how through a change of consciousness within even a minority of people, that change of consciousness can inspire change in many others, and so we can move forward in that way. I was interested in some research project that I'd heard about that you were engaged in, when people came to the beaches of Europe in different places, and you carried out some research. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
This is, we have a very strong team in the centre that's looking at the Mediterranean migration crisis, as it was called, and is with us still. It's a crisis caused by millions of people fleeing as a result of the conflict in the Middle East, in Syria in particular, and Iraq and Afghanistan before. And I found it really interesting, as I was saying, that we call this a crisis of migration. But actually it's not a crisis of migration, it's a crisis in Europe as to how to deal with this issue. We have the crisis, I think, but that's another point. So what we were concerned to do, the contribution you can make, is to seek out stronger evidence about what's happening, rather than making assumptions. And policy needs evidence upon which to build. So how do you deal with 1 million refugees who arrive at the border to your country? Unless you understand the processes, the behaviours, the fears, the realities. So we were commissioned. We did persuade someone to help us. We went to the beaches in Greece, in Malta, in Italy. We spoke to just over 600 migrants as they got out of their boats, as they were pulled out of the water in some cases. My team are brilliant, I have to say. And we asked them questions that no one else had asked them, because we challenged assumptions, because we felt that in order to trust the relationship between policymakers and migrants needs to have a trust basis in order to be effective for both. We asked them, what did you do in the last hour before you left your home, your village, your community, before you fled? And when you left, what, in addition to your children and your mobile phone, did you bring with you? Now, if you think of the answers to these questions, they're hugely powerful about the nature of the crisis, the nature of the behavior, the nature of the trauma. More than 2/3 of migrants, in the last hour before they left their homes, buried their treasure. Took their valuables that they weren't going to be able to carry and hid them. The same number, more than 2/3, slightly higher, I believe, in addition to their children and their mobile phone, brought the key to their doors and could show it to the interviewees. So it's a whole set of understandings about the nature of the challenge these people were facing, and their motivations and their long-term plans were much clearer to me. So when you take evidence like that to politicians, it's why I have real problems trusting them sometimes, I'm afraid. And you say, look, how are you dealing with people that are very evident by our research planning to go home? You're dealing with them as if they're coming to steal your hospital beds, to take your jobs, to create more housing problems. And the countries of Europe should be ashamed, in my private opinion, personal opinion, at putting barriers up against people so traumatized. It's not easy, wouldn't suggest for a minute. But how can you have a trust-based relationship between a challenged political process, the governments of Europe, and a traumatized migrant force on the way? And you need that, unless you have a clarity and an evidence about what's happening. And I at the time last year, I had a huge respect for only one leading European politician, Angela Merkel, who did actually open the doors and followed a policy based on an emotion and some of that evidence, of course, and opened the doors to nearly 1 million people. The consequence of her action, however, has led to a whole political trauma within her country, replicated, of course, and copied here as well. So how does trust relate to that story? It relates in a very powerful way. Should we approach dealing with these mass migrations, these human catastrophes, in a sense where we don't trust those who are vulnerable, that they automatically have sinister and individual motivations? They're coming here to do us harm, even if it's simply by making us more crowded. Or should we approach them by a sense of reality, of let's find out what's happening. Let's not assume we can trust everybody, but let's find out first before we jump to distrust. Now, all the research we do in the world won't change the fact that trust is really difficult to encourage, and the distrust is much more easy. I often say, that the forces of prejudice are much more easy to adopt and use than the forces for pluralism.
Could I come in there? Because I think it's something that I've been leading on from what you're saying. I have a particular interest in compassion and self-compassion, and I was at a conference recently, and the person was saying that the true test of any spirituality is not the compassion you feel for your loved one or your close one. It's really the compassion you feel for people you maybe don't like, or you feel very much are the other. And I'm curious in both your situations as to say, Mike, when you're working with communities in real conflict that really have that dislike for each other, how you've managed to, what are the tools that you've used that have bridged that difference, those differences, and actually enabled them to trust each other? And also for Jayanti, I'm thinking, even within this community, there's a lot of coherence and people have shared values, but you still see people who fall out and there is a lot of conflict and they don't trust each other. So it's at that edge where, in a way, where the differences are very marked and the feelings are very strong. How do you build trust in those situations? So it's something I'd ask both of you.
I'd never claim that we were totally successful, but two things that I reflect back quite positively. I worked for a time, the end of the 1990s, in Ramallah in East Jerusalem, when President Arafat was seeking to develop a Palestinian authority that could have a conversation with his neighbours on a more positive way. The Oslo treaties were in place. There was a period of hope, very short-lived. But I was only a young advisor, but I found that these big political people had an animosity that was fundamental to some of their opponents, of course. So the senior Palestinians had very little respect for senior Israelis and vice versa. So, it taught me that you were never going to get these people to like each other or even to trust each other at all. They could put up all sorts of structures to protect themselves against their lack of trust and behaviours. But you did have to encourage them to go along the road of respecting each other. And that respect would make a huge amount of difference, because that is, as you were saying earlier, to put yourself first and understand yourself, and then put yourself into the place of the other. And the second circumstance is we're still working on. This year is the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement in the north of Ireland. And we've been working for the last 2 years. I've just published a booklet on how to cultivate peace in these places. And there, the degree of fundamental lack of respect between the sectarian divides still exists. And I think that we've made a lot of progress, thanks mainly to the women of Ireland, who stood up and said, that's enough. This violence has to stop. We made a lot of progress with reforming the police. We changed the police force in Northern Ireland to become a police service. Not unimportant change. We've changed the judicial procedures. We've changed representative government. We've changed housing policies. We've looked at schools. All sorts of things. But we haven't actually spent a lot of time developing more respect one for another. And it's not a question of everybody getting on. We don't have to have a world in which everybody likes each other, everybody agrees with each other. That would be quite tedious. But we have to respect each other, and I think that's for me, in my limited experience, I think is the basis upon which trust is based. So I don't like you, I don't agree with you, you're very different from me, you make noise at night and your food smells funny, but actually, I get it, that you should be able to be here, that you're part of our community. We should get there as quickly as possible. Because we still have a bucket load of problems with noise and smells and languages and colours and clothes. But if we had a degree of respect one for another, and I think that comes exactly from where you were describing it, we'd have a better chance.
Your thoughts on respect?
It's a very real situation in which, although on the one side we are a very powerful, cohesive community that's able to do quite a lot, yet there are individual differences, and there's also the possibility of conflict, because I want it this way and the other wants it this way. And what I find is that because we come together every day for silent meditation, personally as well as collectively. And secondly, we come together to study spiritual teachings. When I hear the lesson, I take something from it. And when the other is hearing the lesson, they take something else from it. But that then keeps us on track and makes us come together. And so that awareness that I'm changing and I need to change more. And so recognizing that, yes, if the other is going through something, whatever it is they're going through, it's okay. They're taking their time about it. Well, I took a long time. And so they'll also go through the process of change. And so when we follow the path of spirituality with that integrity, knowing that I have to change and I have to have the humility to recognize my own shortcomings, to be able to accept the other, that acceptance allows us to move forward together.
I was curious also in our earlier conversation, because we were talking about how there does seem to be a lack of trust in the world and there is more anxiety. And Mike, you commented that actually there was more trust in the world, which we found a bit curious. Do you want to explain why you felt there was more trust in the world? Because that seems contrary to
I know,
the
and
sort of zeitgeist.
and people don't like it when I have this view that there's also more peace now than there's been for a long period of time, depending on which indexes you use. It does seem that we're in a pretty traumatic time and a pretty challenging and very violent time. And that's largely because this is what's shown to us all the time. And the reason I think that we have more trust now is because we do have other structures in place which help these relationships. We have a global capitalist model. We have a lot more travel now. We have social media. We have the digital world in which there's much more transparency and openness. That has the dark side as well. I quite agree. But I think that we do have a strength in our families and communities and regions and nations, and a confidence enlarged that has led to our being less anxious about being vulnerable to others than before. Now, maybe I'm just a glass half full kind of guy, you know. But I think I think we're not without our challenges now at all. I had a much better time a few years ago, I have to say. I slept better at night when there was a global consensus that the climate needed to be dealt with. We had to deal with climate change. We had to take seriously. I thought that this was going to be a big moment when the world said, all right, we can put aside all these rather trivial things because there's a mega problem coming up. But we've slipped a bit since then, haven't we?
Any words of hope from you, Jayanti?
On the one side, I see the darkness and the violence, the terrorism, and everything reaching a sort of extreme situation, and it's as if the anger of human beings and the violence against nature in particular is causing the reaction from nature, and so we see more traumatic things happening within climate in a very big way last year, already in some places this year too. But I also see light entering the world. I see more and more people talking about consciousness. I see the cutting edge of science talking about consciousness and explaining consciousness. I see more people interested in plant-based diet. So all of these things are the hope for the future, I think. On a very positive side, I see how, because we now have multicultural communities. For example, in London, when I arrived as a child, I was the only Indian girl at school, and that carried on all the way through till the end of secondary school, really. But things started to change, and today, because communities are so mixed, you get to learn to love your neighbour, actually. You know more about them, you understand them more, and you begin to work together. And so, yes, I see that that's been a very positive side of what's happened in the world.
What's shifting a lot is we know this from demographics, is the trust between communities of difference, particularly hierarchical, those with power and those without, those with economic advantage and those that are disadvantaged. They're becoming much sharper problems. Within a socioeconomic grouping, there's a lot more consistency and cohesion we're seeing. You know, in the last census in the United Kingdom, the fastest changing demographic statistics, mixed marriages. It's interesting, isn't it? This is the fastest growing metric we have in demographic change. And I think we are a much more multicultural community. But when the multicultural group that has nothing interfaces with the multicultural group that has a lot, we have problems. I think inequality is the difference that matters rather than these other things. And I remember a lesson from President Arafat when I was a young advisor. So, you know, in 2 years of working with him, he never once spoke to me in English. He spoke. He's gone, of course. Spoke fluent English, fluent Arabic, and fluent French. He never spoke to me in English. I speak French. He always spoke to me in my second language, French. And when I challenged him on this, he said the international organizations never treated him with respect. They'd always expect to speak English and have him on the back foot. And it was about asymmetrical dialogue. It's about power. I learned a lot from that. And it's interesting. And I go back to my point about respect. Yeah. They didn't respect him, and he as a result approached negotiations, discussions and so forth in a particular way, I think. Whether he respected them, that's another issue. We'll come back.
So a lot of depth in this whole issue of respect. I see time is moving on, and it's now at the point where we would like to invite any questions from yourselves. So we have a roving mic here. So just thinking about the richness of this discussion and the ideas that you've heard, would anyone like to ask a question? This gentleman here, down the front.
First of all, let me thank Sister Jayanti for inviting me, and it's an extremely interesting topic for discussion today. I want to ask all the speakers the importance of bringing about the knowledge of forgiveness in bringing about trust. Because as the gentleman said, that in Palestine there's always the hate and anger, and with forgiveness comes healing. And I would like to hear from Sister Jayanti the spiritual evolution of how to bring about forgiveness in the conscience of the people.
There's an idea that I believe in very strongly, and that is that in forgiveness there is freedom for the self. And in terms of individuals, I've seen it work in a very powerful way, that if I can experience the opening of my heart and a generosity of spirit, and I'm able to forgive, then in that forgiveness I find freedom, but I'm also allowing the other person to be free too. And so that's something that I know that the power of spirituality can facilitate. I know that it can happen without spirituality also, in an official sense, and probably that person already has something of the spirit within them, but especially when you're following a path of silence and meditation, it helps very much to allow that aspect of forgiveness to develop. I know that within a spiritual community, that concept of forgiveness again works very beautifully, but how do you facilitate it within another community, a racial community that has been wronged by invasion or terrorism or whatever? I'm not sure. I haven't seen that happen. As I say, individually, I know it can happen, but have you seen it happen?
No, it's a very good question, and I'd add reconciliation. It's another word, another process which is hugely important and very important within the work in Coventry and then the work in peace and reconciliation there. I agree, though, entirely. I think forgiveness is about you as an individual. It's about self. I don't think it's something you apply to a context over the top. It's about how you come to terms with events, with trauma, with whatever's happened to you, and whether you can see a future in which you can remove some of the toxicity in the relationship. I'm not convinced that forgiveness is real, other than in the way in which you approach the situation. That I've never been in a position, because I'm very privileged and very fortunate, in which someone's done something so desperately bad to me personally that I'd had to assess whether I could forgive them or not. So I don't feel qualified in that sense. But I see forgiveness as an enormously important part of you. And it's saying that you are going to draw a line in some way and move to a different place with the relationships. But we all know some of the things that have happened in humankind have been just awful.
There's a very powerful, I'm sure you can see it on YouTube, someone directed to me, was one of the women who were the twins, one of the twins that the Nazi doctors experimented on, and she spoke amazingly powerfully about it was her right. You know, no, it wasn't like forgiveness was something that someone else could impose on her. It was her choice and her right to forgive these people for what they did, and she speaks incredibly eloquently on how empowering that is for her. because it was her sense of agency. It's my right to forgive you. You can't make me forgive you.
Yeah.
I would really recommend watching that.
It is a self thing.
It says a lot on forgiveness. So any other questions? This gentleman in the blue hat?
My question really is to both speakers. And if we look at the history you've just mentioned about war and the horrible experimentation that happened in the concentration camps in the First World War, the terrible things that happened in the trenches, and the gassing and so on, and then Vietnam, the mind experiments that went on, and now we're in this mind control era. It's no different propaganda, but when you're looking at your mobile phone, or you're looking at your computer, or you're looking at the TV, or you're looking at whatever medium it is, there's always some kind of vested interest there. Adverts popping up everywhere, convincing you that you have to buy the latest this or that. So it's a mild form, but I think it's a growing form of mind control. How do you see people keeping control of themselves, being aware enough to be able to cope with this next phase of development of humanity?
How long have we got? This is there's a very strong relationship in my book, the way I think, between the transactions we have in our economic model and our economic systems, and the issues we've been talking about in terms of social relations. So I get where you're coming from. I think, however, there's also the ability with our young people, with education, with thinking more about self and about the sorts of issues we've been talking about, well, there'll be challenge to these processes. We will tackle. I don't think it's all one way. We live in an individualized, commercial, market capitalist process and system, which doesn't help. Doesn't help with egalitarian principles or values that I have about equality and opportunity. But at the same time, we mobilize parliamentary democracy. We regulate badly sometimes, but we regulate more and more. And I think this is a continuing and evolving social contract, and I'm optimistic that we'll get there.
Meditation is actually being able to take charge of my own mind and becoming very aware of what are the influences that I'm exposed to, whether it's on the human personal level in the interaction, and when we meet together, one person, 5 people, whatever it is, there's always this exchange of energy and influence, and who is influencing who in what way. And the same thing with any aspect of media. There's going to come an influence, and meditation makes me very aware of what are the influences that I'm exposed to. And so I make sure that I stay very alert. I make sure that I keep my connection with the one above, so that it's that influence that's able to protect me and guide me. We live in an era of post-truth, and so there's a lot of fake news around, never mind advertising, but fake news. And so I have to just simply make sure that my inner awareness, my consciousness, my conscience stays very clear, very bright, so that then I can see what's going on and be able to protect myself. So, meditation.
You mentioned about lack of trust in politicians. We've got a very big political process happening now with Brexit. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of people in the UK who have a lack of trust in politicians. Do you think the politicians who are negotiating across Europe have trust in each other? And do you think, because the stories we have on a daily basis are almost like gossip, reporting of what's happening, it kind of perpetuates a lack of trust, it's not helping. Do you think they can operate successfully in this environment of lack of trust? Do you think they can build it? And do they need help to build that trust so that they can be more successful? Just either of you have an opinion on that?
So we're talking about trust being a positive force that can be used to make a better world and so forth. Don't for 1 minute mistake my own views on this, and if I've been inarticulate, I apologise. I don't think that we can trust everyone, and I don't think we want to trust anyone. Sometimes you need to put in place structures that protect you, because trust doesn't always work. In the political process currently, I think you're right. I don't think there's a degree of trust between the people who will be impacted by this decision and those who are negotiating the constructs around it. I don't think the European leaders trust each other. I don't think the people that voted for the European leaders trust their leaders. So I don't think it would be a good thing to trust them at all. So we have to build other structures and other relationships around that, I think. So if you had a much more powerful sense of trust in local communities that could work together at mitigating the consequences of this insanity, then that would be better, I think. But yeah, the research I did in Mongolia I referred to earlier. In Mongolia, they have no legislation which requires retailers to tell you what's in the ingredients of food. They have no legislation that requires them to tell you the eat-by date or the sell-by date. The Chinese, in their infinite successful economic model, take all their old products and dump them in Mongolia. There is nothing to stop them because there's no regulations. It's an immature state in that respect. So nobody trusts the Chinese when they sell their foodstuffs there, and that's just common sense in a sense. So what they do is they build other structures around it because they don't have a truth in lending or a truth in advertising legislation. They have other ways of doing it. Word of mouth. Communities mobilize. They don't eat bad food. It soon gets around. It's quite remarkable to watch how clever we are when we're faced with these things. And I'm interested now to watch in how clever we'll become to deal with the mess we're in with Brexit. Because I think we will deal with it. I think we will not want a bordering island. We will not want the continued savaging of our fisheries. We will not want our farmers to go bankrupt. We will not want all the downsides. So we'll deal with it. I'm sure we will. It's my half-filled cup again. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Well, I think we all need half-filled cups these days, for sure. I'd like to invite Jayanti now to lead us in a reflection, so we can have a few minutes to actually sit in that safe space of silence inside and really reflect on what trust means to us. So if you'd like to all join us in a short meditation now.
Hearing about trust, thinking about all the ideas I've been listening to, I find myself in a reflective space in which it's very natural to go on an inner journey. And as I go inside, the question that comes up in my own mind is a question of how much do I trust myself? And am I able to connect with the core values that I hold within myself? What are those core values? Going deeper and deeper inside, I realize that one of the deepest searches of the soul has been to find peace. And I'm able to touch the peace that I carry deep within myself. And as I become peaceful, another door opens, and I realize that within my own inner sacred space, there is love. I had forgotten that peace and love are within me. And it gives me hope for the future to again discover this once more, that I carry peace and love within. And as my mind becomes quiet, filled with love, I can sense that my original state of being is one of truth. There is truth within myself. And my trust in myself grows with this discovery. I wonder whether the people I connect with also have the same values as I do. And I realize that all human beings, all souls, have peace and love and truth in their hearts. And this is how I must learn to see them. To see them with that vision of the being that they are and the inner values that they hold. Holding this awareness, I come back to the moment here and now. Now more aware of the treasures inside my own inner world, and that vision for others too. Om Shanti. I am peace.
So I hope you've found this evening stimulating, that it's stirred some curiosity in you to explore this subject in more depth. It certainly left me thinking about respect and what is respect. I'm sure that's another topic we could mine in great depth. And just looking back over the last hour or so, you know, Mike started talking about the who do we trust. That idea of how we behave is really important. and the ingredients of trust, this idea of competence, integrity, benevolence and predictability. Jayanti shared how it starts from the inside, learning to trust myself and perhaps something greater than myself as well. And where does that come from, that inner dignity and self-respect, those inner core values? And how the behaviour creates the identity, who am I? This idea of coming from the inside out, and that journey within that we do with meditation. And in your conversation, this idea of dialogues at the edge, and how does spirituality contribute to these difficult areas, these difficult conversations, and really how we're all hoping we can build these communities of trust. When I was telling someone about this evening, and they reminded me of a film where the family had circles of trust, and that was all very important. But that reminded me of that. How can we build circles of trust, communities of trust? And this is really where the hope for the future lies, and how we can do this locally and with our feet on the ground. It's very practical. It's difficult, but it's with that respect and love and building those circles of trust that we can do it. So thank you both so much to our speakers for their contribution. It's been, you're both incredibly special people who've contributed so much to this area of peace building and community building. So thank you both for not just this evening, but all the work you do in your lives. It's a real inspiration.